In BuildShip, variables are key value pairs that can be accessed by workflow nodes or across multiple workflows. They are useful for storing non-sensitive information like configuration settings, default values, or constants that need to be referenced throughout a workflow. By using variables, you can streamline your workflow execution, you can reduce redundancies, and simplify updates by modifying values in a single location rather than adjusting multiple nodes individually. In this video, we'll show you how to use local variables and environment variables in your BuildShip workflows. We'll take a short break from working on our weekly news tracker workflow, and we'll create a brand new BuildShip workflow to use as our variables playground. So we'll create a new workflow. We'll just start from scratch and we'll call it variables. Now that we have created a brand new BuildShip workflow, the first type of variables that we want to look at will be the local variables. Local variables will allow you to store and modify values throughout your workflow. Once you've defined a local variable in your workflow, you will be able to modify the value of that variable throughout the different steps of your workflow. Let's walk through an example. Let's add a new node and we'll select the set variable node. You can use this node to start defining local variables for your workflow. The first thing we'll need to do here is add a new variable and give it a name. And we'll just call this name because we're going to be storing a name in this variable. And then you can select the type. We'll just go with string. And then save. And now we have added a new local variable to our BuildShip workflow. To start with, we can define a value for the name. So I'll just enter here John Doe. Next, we can access the variable value from other nodes in our workflow. So let's do that. We'll add a new node and we'll search for log and we'll add the log message to console node. We can use this node to log any messages we want to the console. We haven't went over how to log messages in your workflow, but we'll have a future video that will talk about all things logging and how you can debug your workflows whenever you have any errors. For now, what we want to do is just log the value of the name variable. So for the message input, we'll delete this and then we can select the variable. Just go to local variables and select the name variable. And now we can test our workflow to see it working. We're getting back undefined here, but that's okay. What we care about is going to the logs of our workflow. And here we have one log. We can expand this. This is where we'll see the execution of each node in our BuildShip workflow. And if any of those nodes log any messages to the console, we'll see them here. And you can see for the log message to console node, we are logging back successfully the value of the variable that we set, John Doe. Perfect. But once you've defined the variable, there's nothing stopping you from changing it. And how do you change a variable? Well, you just add back a set variable node. You select the variable that you want to change, and then you just update the value to whatever value you want. So let's change the name from John Doe to Jane Smith, and we'll add a new log message to console node. We'll change the message here, and we want to output the value of our name variable. Now let's test the workflow again. Perfect. If we go back to the logs, we have a new entry here. So this is our first log message to console, and the variable is set to John Doe. But if we scroll down a bit, we have our second log message to console, and this time the value that it's outputting is Jane Smith. And that's fully expected. That's because we initialized our variable with the name John Doe, and when we logged it here, the value was still John Doe. And after that, we selected the variable name and we changed the value to Jane Smith. And now when we log the value of this variable, it changed from John Doe to Jane Smith. Here's a different approach of how you can manage these local variables. You can click the settings icon, and then here you can add a new variable, and let's call this one age, and we'll switch the type from string to number, and then we can save it. And here we have our new age variable. If you want, you can delete it or you can edit it. Let's close out of here. Now, if you want to give your age variable a default value whenever the workflow is initialized, you can just add a set variable node again, select the age variable, and give it a default value of 18. And just as with the name variable, you can access the age variable from other nodes. You just go to variables, local variables, and age. Now let's test our flow again. Let's look at the logs. And then this time, instead of logging John Doe, we log the age, which we set a default value of 18. Next, let's look at environment variables. Environment variables provide a bit more flexibility over local variables. With environment variables, you can instantiate them at the project level, meaning that you can access environment variables from across multiple workflows in the same BuildShip project. On the contrary, if you only want to store data that is useful to a particular workflow, then you can also scope environment variables to the workflow level. Let's see some examples, but first we'll clean up this workflow and just delete these variables that we've previously added. Let's delete this, and let's delete this log message to console. And let's just leave it with the one log message to console node. For the message input, let's delete this. And then let's see how we can configure environment variables. We'll go to where it says variables, and then environment variables, and manage environment variables. This is how we can manage environment variables through the UI. There's an important note here where it's telling you that you shouldn't store any fragile data inside environment variables. Instead, what you should do is store them inside of secrets. You can refer to the previous video where we looked at how to authenticate nodes and store API keys securely using secret keys. For now, let's imagine that we want to store an environment variable for our website URL. Maybe this is a value that we need to reference across multiple workflows for generating invoices or referencing in emails that we send to our clients. So we can add a variable, we'll give it a key name, and we'll call it website URL. And for the value, we can just enter example.com. And next, we can select the scope for our environment variable. So we can make it be available to all workflows on this project or this workflow only. Let's select all workflows on this project, and then we can save it. And now we have our new environment variable created, and we can edit it here or we can delete it. Let's close out of here. And now we can reference this environment variable from any other nodes in our workflow. It's the same process as it is with local variables. Just go to variables, and then this time, environment variables, and then we can select the environment variable we just created. And we can test our flow again to see the output. If we go to the logs, and we expand this one, we can see that we get example.com outputted to the console. Perfect. Since we scoped our environment variable on the project level, that means that we can go back to any other workflow in our project and use it. Let's do that in our old scrape website workflow. I'll just delete this old JSON generator node, and I'll add a new log message to console node. And the value that we want to log will be our environment variable, the website URL. Now let's test the workflow. We'll close out of this. We'll go to the logs, And we can refresh to see the recently added log. If we expand it, we can expand the log message to console. And then here you can see that we're getting the example.com URL outputted. And next, we'll show you how you can programmatically update the value of an environment variable inside of your node logic. We'll do it in the same log message to console node. We'll bring up the code for the node. And don't worry if you haven't written a single line of code in your life or if you have little to no experience writing code. This is going to be pretty straightforward. First, we need to access the env object. So after logging, we'll type e, and instead of logging the message to console, we want to change its value. To do that, we'll type await env.set, or actually, let's go back and you'll see you have a couple of options here. You can actually delete an env programmatically. You can retrieve its value, or what we're looking to do is update its value, so we'll use set. And then we'll need to pass in an array of the environment variables we want to update. So we just want to update one, so we'll just enter a single object here. Next, we need to specify the name of the environment variable we want to update. So we'll say name, and then here we need to enter the name for the environment variable. If you recalled, we called it website URL. And next, we need to specify the value we want to change it to. So let's just change it to BuildShip.com. We're getting a type error here because we need to mark this function as asynchronous. This is how you have the ability to update an environment variable programmatically in any of your node's logic. So we'll save this. We'll test this node. But oh no, we're getting an error. This is actually an expected error. If you recall, when we created our environment variable, we scoped it to the project level. And here we're getting an error message, couldn't save project environment variable. This is because whenever you're updating an environment variable programmatically, you need to explicitly specify the scope for the environment variable. To do that, we'll need to add a second option here and specify project. Now let's save the node and let's test it again. And this time we didn't get any error message. Let's rotate back to our variables workflow. And in this workflow, we're logging the website URL environment variable to console. So now when we log this, we're expecting the value to not be example.com, but to instead be BuildShip.com. So let's test the workflow. We're not getting any errors. Let's go back to the console and let's refresh the logs. We'll click the latest one, expand the log message to console, and we're now getting back BuildShip.com. With that, you should now have a good understanding of local variables and environment variables. To end this video, we'll put variables to practical use in our weekly news tracker workflow. And we'll be using a local variable. If we take a look at the instructions we're using for the Perplexity AI node, we're saying give me top 5 news for the specified topics. The number 5 here is a constant value, and this would be a good use case for a local variable. So we'll add a new node, we'll add the set variable node, and we'll add a variable, and we'll call this max news. And we'll change the type from string to a number, and we'll save it. And we'll set the default value to 5. And then we'll update our instructions. And instead of having this hard-coded 5, we'll select the max news variable by going to local variables, max news. In the next video, we'll cover what you will most likely find to be the most interesting topic we've looked at so far. We'll be going over BuildShip's AI Builder features.